morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Hope you're all well. How's it, Thor? Hello, everybody. Thanks. I got a greeting from Thor. Let somebody's awake. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this this follow-on webinar. A big welcome to the Primerio team as well. Thank you, Mike, for again giving up your time, bringing your team on. Just helping us to work through some of these very, very complex issues in the sector that we are all facing and, trying to make sense of as we go along. There's always something new that we're trying to deal with and, come to terms with. So for those of you that don't know, Michael James, or Mike as he's known, is a director at Primerio, but he's also co-founder of the Primerio SA practice. He's got his regulatory and commercial law practice is a Pan-African practice, and they actually deal across several African countries, including Botswana, Egypt, Kenya, Mauritius, Namibia, Nigeria, South Africa, Tanzania. And key areas of the practice include commercial and corporate law, competition law, and complex commercial litigation. You've been recognized as best lawyer in SA for more than once, and you also serve as the global law expert in competition law in Nigeria. I see on LinkedIn, I often see, Mike, you speaking all over the place, and you publish articles, papers, and opinion pieces, and you currently serve as the African Regional Representative for the International Bar Association's Anti-Corruption Committee. So your disclaimer, you were just good people. So today and this morning, we're just going to, this is sort of a follow on a breakfast that we hosted just over a month ago with some of our members, where we spoke a little bit about competition law in South Africa. There's quite a bit of interest. There's a lot of mergers and acquisitions at the moment, and in fact, a lot of this has meant that the sector is things are really slow at the moment. So I get a lot of calls and people are saying, "Hey, what's happening? Nobody's building. What's going on?" And we know it's because there's a lot of wooing and flirting in the market at the moment, and I think we've spoken about this for many years. We've said that we expect huge consolidation in the market. Currently, 50 plus FNOs. And some of the stuff, has got an impact on the market, so things are slow. But we also wanted to understand, some of the companies that are keen to look at selling off their assets or, looking at merging or getting acquired, what does the competition law say about it? How do you prepare yourself and your submission to the CompCom? And it was a very insightful session. Talking to somebody that's on the adjudication committee at the CompCom and having an interview. That was really insightful. But we ran out of time, and we said we'll do an online session so that we can include more people. And the reason why we wanted to do that was that there was great interest in the Competition Commission's public interest guidelines in relation to merger control. So all of it in relation to merger control, which they published in March this year. And Mike, I'm not going to delve into a lot of this because I waffle around it because I'm incredibly uncomfortable with this topic, and I know as little as about as much as this as I would be about flying a 747. Which, well, you're a pilot, so it's an unfair comment as well. But I'm going to hand over to you and then let you fly this plane because I'm going to crash and burn it. So yeah, over to you.
Thank you, Anita. Thanks for all those kind words. The last conference of that, Anita, the moderator said anyone who requires more than one line of introduction isn't well known. So I might have to relook at my my CV before being introduced. But thank you for the kind words and for inviting me onto your platforms to chat to the members. And you're absolutely right. I think it was a really intriguing session we had a couple of weeks ago with one of the tribunal panel members, Thando Vilakazi. I'm not sure. I see from some of the names, some of you would have been there. And that I think you summed it up perfectly, was really great to get a perspective from the bench, a view from the bench. There's a lot of, and I think it's not just in the competition parlance, it's across the board, a lot of, clickbait headlines, commentary out there, some of it accurate and justified, and a lot of it isn't. And I think there's a lot of noise in this space in particular, and to try and understand what is of real concern, what is not of a concern, and perhaps what is where are the opportunities perhaps in this whole maze, in this whole conundrum. And this sector is certainly a highly regulated one. There are also some opportunities, and I think one's always got to not look at these issues, and certainly we don't, with sort of blinkers on, and always trying to look at where and how to pivot the complexities in order to get the most commercial and prudent outcome for our clients. Having said all of that, I do think there are significant concerns with the topic we're going to discuss today. It's not a concern which has sprung up and caught us by surprise, but I think it has caught business by surprise, both South Africa and international clients doing business here. And I think it's important to canvass very briefly. Most of you by now, I'm sure, that have an interest in this topic are going to be very aware of public interest in merger control. It's been around. It's not a new or novel topic. It's been around for more than a decade now. It's certainly since the Massmart Walmart deal, it really gained prominence in the assessment of mergers. The law has incrementally developed from a precedential basis, and what we saw following the Walmart decision, we saw a couple of cases, really well contested cases, and contested cases at least have the advantage of forcing adjudicative bodies or agencies to grapple with all the countervailing arguments, all these polycentric issues. And I think as one of the speakers at the SBA event last week put it neatly, it's always a policy trade-off. Is it short-term versus medium-term policy trade-offs? What are the policy trade-offs? And you could grapple with that, and from that put forward a framework which is at least as objectively quantifiable as possible. And I think that's highly important for any parties seeking to do deals in any capacity or before any regulator. Is you want some certainty, whether or not you agree with the policy approach or you agree with the law. That's one thing, but you certainly want to understand how that law is going to be applied, and will it be applied in a sensible manner. And I think the earlier decisions by the Competition Tribunal and Competition Appeal Courts did quite a good job at explaining how do you balance public interest factors, assessments, criteria, and the like. Then around 2018, there were these proposed amendments to the Competition Act, where the public interest provisions, the grounds in the Act, were expanded to include ownership criteria, worker ownership, and BEE ownership, or actually not BEE, HDP ownership, and also the ability of small, medium SMME and HDP controlled firms in the market to participate more effectively. Those became two self-standing grounds, and the Act and the subsequent guidelines made it quite clear that these public interest factors are weighted equally to competition assessments. So ordinarily, a merger, not ordinarily, was still the case, but prior to the new, I would say, the public interest regime 2.0, sort of between Walmart and where we are now, you had pretty defined grounds of public interest considerations. The most notable one was always employment. It's very clear that it's a holistic assessment, so the agencies will first go and look and see whether or not the transaction is likely to result in a substantial lessening of competition in the market, and then allied to that would then assess whether or not there's any justification for prohibiting the transaction or imposing conditions based on public interest concerns. Now, at a notional level, and one which hasn't yet been squarely tested, although I think is very much accepted to be the case, an anti-competitive merger could still be approved subject to pro-public interest effects, and vice versa. Pro-competitive merger could be prohibited based on adverse effects on any of the public interest grounds. And then there's supposed to be so that's your first holistic assessment. And then your second holistic assessment is weighing up the public interest grounds against each other. So a merger which is going to result in significant job losses, but will help an industry become more competitive on an international scale. Those could be weighed up against each other. Both are public interest grounds weighed up against each other and netted off. Now, all of that sounds relatively sensible in terms of a notional framework. I think there's always the risk, and it's always been one of our broader critiques of public interest criteria in merger control, is how does one actually weigh up and quantify these effects, and how do you rank or prioritize effects against each other, and that's an issue which agencies all over the world are having. We speak into a lot of international platforms and lobby really on behalf of business for sound, objective competition policy and enforcement, both across the region and also think tanks like the IBA, the OECD, the American Bar Association. And the whole world is in the competition policy having this debate now about, should competition law and policy still be what it was, 40, 50 years ago, or should competition law be used as a tool to address other socio policies, objectives, priorities. And again, I think there's a lot of talk about that, but there's still a really long way to go, even in other agencies, about, well, how does one actually evaluate it? How does one ensure that the adjudicative bodies or the decision makers are doing so and assessing these issues on a objective and objective basis and against some form of benchmark or criteria that is tangible. There's always a risk, and it's one which I think is particularly prevalent or going to be particularly prevalent in South Africa. But it's not it's not just here. We see the same critique in Europe and elsewhere, where as soon as you start introducing these other interests and factors and considerations, it's very easy for a deal to become highly politicized. It's very easy for subjective decision making to come into play, and that is what we, certainly on behalf of business, have been at pains to try and point out and to mitigate throughout the processes of the amendments to the Act and the guidelines, and how those considerations are interpreted. There's no doubt under the competition authorities fall under initially the EDD, now DTIC, both at the respective periods under Minister Patel's portfolio, if you like, department. And there's no doubt, and I think that's it's not an open secret. But Mr. Patel's been very public and very vocal about how he wishes to use the competition authorities and the Competition Act in order to advance various socioeconomic objectives. So that is a very clear and transparent policy decision by the department. The competition authorities are, of course, supposed to be independent and all the rest, but that is a clear government direction, and that is largely what inspired the amendments to the Act, and it's largely what resulted in the format of the Act and the guidelines, and I think the Competition Commission in particular, their approach to public interest assessments at the moment. So we started seeing far more aggressive intervention by, again, initially it was Department of Economic Development, now DTIC, in mergers. You started seeing merger parties engaging far more frequently. Sorry, I see a hand up, Simone.
Sorry to interrupt. I don't know if I can ask a question now or afterwards, but just while you're on the topic, I'd love to know, the trends that you're seeing in terms of the instances in which the DTIC does intercept. So, are you seeing that it's specific sectors? Is it certain merger thresholds? I'd love a little bit of insight there, but happy if you handle that question at the end. Thanks.
Thanks, Sabina. Yeah, it's a very good question. Let me address it now. I think the DTIC has certain sectors where it's identified as priority sectors, not necessarily the same priority sectors what the Competition Commission has, but sectors where it really thinks there's a great scope for greater participation by SMEs in the market, or sectors which are concerned about being highly concentrated and dominated by a handful of very large multinational and local companies. Absolutely, where there are public interest issues at play. But I think the sectors where we see the most significant intervention is certainly the big international deals. And I don't think that's too surprising. I think Minister Patel, and there's an article where he's quite quoted, in saying this, actually saying that basically international parties need to pay their public interest tax in South Africa. So he's unashamedly seeking to extract conditions and these big sort of supply development funds, the big intervention on, let's say, the AB InBev, SAB deal, SAB Coca-Cola deals, a lot of the big sort of international deals is where he has quite vehemently got involved. Obviously started back in the Walmart case, but we've seen far more low-key deals, deals which we would have thought really are not really headline-grabbing deals. They don't really raise any massive competition concerns. You're not dealing with a national champion or a massive multi-corporate deals which ordinarily should have gone through unscathed, and you'd see quite a significant intervention. And then other deals where one would anticipate some form of intervention go through unhindered. So unfortunately, there's no absolute blueprint. But I think the prevalence of intervention has grown significantly in the last 10 years. The number of deals where the DTIC is making submissions, has concerns, wants something from the parties, that has certainly increased. And I'm not sure if it's always in a systematic basis. But that, of course, pose a number of risks, and you started seeing merging parties decide, well, maybe the strategy should be to engage the department.
Marinus, please mute.
Apologies. No problem. So you start to see merging parties take different strategies. Some would go to the department first, try and negotiate a set of remedies, conditions, get the department on board first, and then hopefully the process sails through the competition arena more expeditiously. We're pretty cautious about that approach for a variety of reasons. I think in our experience, those goalposts shift quite frequently when you think you've landed on a deal, you think you've landed on an approved set of conditions or terms, and a week later it's double it. And the goalposts shift. And I think once you enter into that terrain, you don't have any real disciplining effects. And what I mean by that is whatever the Competition Commission's view of a transaction is and whatever their proposal is, in South Africa, we still have a very objective and well-resourced and I suppose experienced adjudicative body going all the way from the Competition Commission, Competition Tribunal, Competition Appeal Court, and then the Constitutional Court. But and a lot of jurisdictions don't have that luxury. They don't have these dedicated bodies to assess these issues. Now, and it's a point I want to get back to about the current guidelines and the current interpretation of public interest and where we stand on it. But the point about the disciplining effect is once you enter into that fray and once you enter negotiations, it's very difficult to then expose, say, well, actually, you've proffered this, and that. You're taking it all off the table, and you now want to deal with this squarely in terms of the law and what the law requires. You've kind of muddied the waters, and you haven't legally, abandoned your rights in any way. But once you put something on the table, it's just always difficult to take that off the table, and that's one of the risks. So, but going back to how public interest is developed. So the act was amended. We put in robust submissions at the time saying to business, look, guys, this is highly concerning. And I think the view from business across many industry associations, platforms and the like were, there are so many challenges that business is trying to resolve. You've got to pick your fights, you'll pick your battles. This isn't the one which business really wants to get behind. And I think it's probably a bit of a missed opportunity, because I think what we predicted happening back then is exactly what is now quite tangible. And so fast forward to where we are now. What are we seeing? The two, or probably the most contentious aspect of the guidelines is the public interest ground, which talks about the promotion of HDP or HDI ownership and worker ownership. And the key word there is this word promote, because that's there's a list of public interest grounds, and it talks about the Commission must assess the merger with reference to the effects on employment, the ability for industries to compete internationally, and inter alia promote ownership. And what the Commission has interpreted promote to mean is to place a positive obligation on every transaction before it, that it must actively promote HDP and or worker ownership. In fact, the Commission actually says and worker ownership, and in practice that they accept sort of the and or. And that's problematic for, I think, a variety of reasons. It is problematic because it's not hard to imagine mergers where a black-owned firm wants to sell out to a international consortium, a la Burger King. I think you all probably seen that in the headlines. Commission initially prohibited that transaction. Grand Parade Investments, who owned the Burger King franchise, it was a BE firm, wanted to sell out to a US investor, and the Commission said no, that's going to dilute ownership levels, so we prohibit. No competition issues or the like. It was taken on request for consideration to the tribunal and really settled before the tribunal had to actually pronounce on these issues. But that's where we saw the first sort of graphic disconnect between the policy objective of this public interest ground and its effects in practice. Because clearly a black-owned firm, if they are already starting in the red when it comes to regulatory approval, it significantly dilutes the pool of buyers who could actually buy them without this heavy regulatory scrutiny. Likewise, I think if this trend continues and it becomes well known and well understood that in any merger you're effectively going to have to give away a certain percentage of equity either to workers or by concluding some sort of HDP transaction on the side, that will dilute the value of every business, right? Any potential acquirer is going to say, well, why am I going to offer you 100% value for your company if there's a risk that I might have to give 10 or 20% of it away, or I might not be able to realize the full value of that 10 or 20%. So you started having these dynamics. Likewise, we get into the point where the Commission is quite clear that they don't care about your existing BE status. So even if you have already got a significant HDP shareholding or BE status or levels, etc., that they view this entirely differently. They say, well, that's a different regulator. We've got our mandate, Competition Act. Wording says promote HDP ownership, worker ownership. Show us how your transaction promotes that ownership. We're also seeing, and this applies across the board, right? And this isn't just your big headline grabbing type deals. So even your vanilla merger filings, private equity firms, where change of control frequently changes hands, that happens all the time. You just put in your notification, technically triggers a threshold, has no real impact in South Africa. It's not a South African centric deal. Certainly no competition issues, and all of a sudden you get hit with these questions, and what are the merging parties going to offer, or what can they offer? So there's no doubt that the biggest risk to deal making, at least in this regulatory space, is the Commission's interpretation on this sector, and I think we are quite literally having those discussions with board members of clients saying, well, if it's so unpredictable and we don't know what we're going to get in South Africa, shouldn't we be cutting South Africa out? Shouldn't we just find all kinds of creative ways to avoid filing, avoid triggering thresholds, and the like? And I think that's a highly unfortunate position and sort of an unintended consequence, which I think the Commission really needs to appreciate, that you don't want to be in a position where business doesn't have confidence in the regulatory system and regime. But that's more for the policy advocacy work that we do a lot of. I think for this group, practically, what are the the big ticket items? How do we deal with it? Where do we stand? So let me start with the point of departure that I don't agree, and I think it's a view shared certainly by most of the colleagues in our firm and probably across the antitrust community. I don't agree with the Commission's interpretation of 12.3AE, which is the promote HDP ownership and what that means. My interpretation, for what it's worth, is that should be seen as a feather in your cap, where there is a transaction that might have job losses but promotes HDP ownership or promotes worker ownership. That should be seen as a positive, and like I said, a feather in the merging party's cap, rather than a cross next to them, or some sort of where the point of departure is. You need to remedy that from the get-go. I think it's for a variety of reasons implausible that parties in a neutral transaction where there's no effect, as we would understand effect, essentially starts from a negative position, has to start remedying something that hasn't actually been altered. But that question hasn't yet been determined. It hasn't been grappled with by the Competition Tribunal nor the Competition Appeal Court. And so we are, and I can't exclude that maybe the Tribunal and the Competition Appeal Court will agree with the Commission. I can't say hand on heart that they won't share the interpretation, but I think there's a very good and very strong argument that the Commission is wrong on this interpretation. And I think the whole industry is really sort of waiting for the test case. What's really going to be the test case? And so we've approached this from, we deal with this on a multitude of transactions in the last couple of months, and it always varies. It's always fact specific. There are some clients who have, for a variety of reasons, drawn a line in the sand and said, no, we're going to follow our sort of interpretation on this, and we're not going to give anything, or we're not going to give anything more than what we're comfortable giving. And the Commission has ultimately approved those transactions unconditionally. We've had most of the clients and most of the transactions we deal with, I think the parties genuinely try and find a workable solution. It might not be equity ownership. It might be other conditions or other remedies, and there are all kinds of, and in this regard, not too dissimilar to sort of perhaps BE codes and some of the initiatives one would have, or that one would explore under sort of the BE regime, but initiatives where one can demonstrate that this transaction is going to have a positive effect above and beyond what would have arisen in the counterfactual absent the transaction, that you can tangibly show a benefit to HDP, smaller business. So anything from bursaries to underprivileged students, or supply development funds committing to employ or appoint contractors that fall within that small, medium, or HDP controlled contractors or suppliers or customers. Some parties have offered some kind of financial assistance to smaller customers, better trading terms, payment terms, and the like. There's no sort of rigid box at this stage in terms of what is possible and plausible. I think the objectives and who the beneficiaries should be is quite broad. I think what's important and really where the rubber hits the road is the Commission want to quantify those benefits. It's not good enough to simply say this transaction is going to have a benefit on all these people, and yes, we'll use best endeavors to do this, and they want to know for how long, how much money, who's going to benefit. So in the conditions, it's got to be very delineated in terms of who's ultimately going to benefit from these conditions. And so I think it's important when considering merger filings, and this is probably the one mistake. Mistake's probably too harsh a word, but perhaps one area which isn't given enough attention at the outset of the transaction. I think everyone's familiar with merger filings. You spend a lot of time on the competition and market report, particularly if there are overlaps, horizontal, vertical overlaps, and then you sort of conclude with the one pager saying, well, if there are job losses, and I'm going to get back to employment as well, because that's also changed. But there'll be some job losses, but we've minimized those job losses. They've rationalized, and there's going to be no other effects on public interest factors. And the filing goes in on that basis, and no one really gives it much more thought. And then it's the 11th hour type situation where the Commission has not yet approved your transaction, particularly if this is a multi-jurisdictional type filing or global deal, and the Commission wants to negotiate on public interest and remedies and conditions, and that's where it puts a lot of deals under, or parties under, significant pressure to, at that stage of a transaction, get around the table and try and understand what can and what can't be done. And the first reaction from everyone, well, nothing can be done. And then you get closer to D-Day, and there's the risk of your deal potentially being prohibited, or subject to conditions which are more onerous than that which you might have wanted to tender. Whose risk do those conditions fall on? What are the parameters that the merging parties are prepared to agree to? So, and you don't really want to be having those negotiations because they can be quite onerous at the 11th hour. So it's important to, at the very least, for parties to understand the risk and the world we're living in now, because it's very different to what it was even 2 years ago, certainly very different to 5 years ago, and undoubtedly different to 10 years ago. What we're dealing with in the last 6 to 12 months is an entirely new regime, far more aggressive, far more robust. So your experiences of deal making in the past is certainly useful, but you must be aware of the sort of, like I said, the sort of 2.0 approach. Important for merging parties to understand upfront, even if it's at a level of principle, even if it's not codified in the agreements, but to at least understand what type of remedies could be imposed, and to what extent would the parties agree with those remedies, versus where's your cutoff point where you say we'll go to X but no more. We'll then run the risk of litigating if needs be, if we do get that adverse decision. That cutoff point is pretty important. The final sort of practical tool is, whenever we deal with these issues, the first couple of calls kind of always go the same way, right? We typically deal often with the International Council. Sometimes we get the in-house legal teams, will be on the call, and again, everyone kind of looks with blank faces saying, but this can't be right, this can't be correct. Okay, eventually one gets them over the legal framework. They now understand, okay, this is what we're dealing with. Then we try and turn to what commercial solutions there are, and again, blank faces. No one really knows what could be workable. And after going through this for 3 or 4 weeks with the commercial teams, with the teams, you start identifying solutions that are actually quite workable, really not too much skin off the merging parties' nose. They might have looked to do some of these initiatives in any event. And typically we can fashion remedies and conditions which, even though we might not think are justified in the first place, are ones which the merging parties will walk away with and say that's not too onerous, not too problematic, and quite happy to commit to those in order to get the deal going. So what I would just encourage is, where you are in the deal making process, try and get the relevant commercial teams understanding the objectives of the law, because it's not just BE, right? It's like I said, you've got to really try and get them to understand what are the parameters and scope and flexibility of the types of conditions that could work, and get their sort of the creativity, I suppose, flowing, because you'll typically find once you do that deep dive, people come up with all kinds of solutions, which we've generally been able to package and tailor in an acceptable way. I think on employment, there are. I actually have a presentation. If I can, maybe I'll just share my screen quickly. One of the key issues in employment is in the previous sort of regime, if you like, the approach that the authorities took was generally identify any potential job losses, retrenchments, and then explain to us as a commission, explain to us how you've arrived at that number, explain to us the process you've taken, explain to us or convince us or provide us comfort, I suppose, that you've taken all reasonable steps to limit those job losses, and then usually that is acceptable in most deals, particularly if it's not, hundreds or thousands of job losses. If it's a few duplicative roles here and there, that's usually, goes through unscathed. If not, if the commission thinks this is maybe too many jobs being lost here, if, the trade unions also have intervention rights. DTIC also intervenes on employment issues. So, sometimes the commission might be sensitive, but usually the remedies are then quite soft. There'd be, can you give some training or counseling to those you're retrenching? Can you, do you commit to rehiring those staff should there be openings that become available through sort of natural attrition? Are there, is there anywhere else in the department, other groups within other business units within a group that can maybe absorb these parties and things like that? And they're not too. If you can show the commission you've taken those steps, you typically don't get the draconian response of 5-year moratorium on merger specific retrenchments. You get that kind of reception or treatment when the commission is not convinced that you've actually meaningfully dealt with employment, or you haven't dealt with it at all. That's when you sort of get those kinds of really rigid moratoriums. The current guidelines are, again, go further than that established practice, and nothing's changed in the Act in respect of employment. So I think the commission is, again, working from a point of departure that a transaction should have zero impact on employment, or any retrenchments means it's a negative public interest effect that must first be remedied. And again, we don't agree with that. We don't agree with the view that a merger that leads to jobs is adverse or shouldn't go ahead on public interest grounds. I think there must be a materiality threshold to it. Yes, of course, there are transactions which may lead to significant job losses, which would be treated differently. But I don't think that's sort of the point of departure. But anyway, the Commission's guidelines have suggested it is. And the parties or the Commission's expectations are that you need to demonstrate that any job losses would really result in some sort of consumer benefit. So, if you're saying that, or if the party's justification for job losses is efficiencies and streamlining and cost savings, the Commission almost expects you to be able to demonstrate how those cost savings are going to be passed on to consumers, which is an incredibly complex and onerous task to evidence with specificity in most organizations, you can't say, okay, well, because I'm saving, R1 million in salaries here, I can clearly show to you how this R1 million is going to be passed on to consumers. I think as economists and as competition lawyers, how we would ordinarily view this is, well, if the market is competitive in the first place, and we're comfortable that there is enough competition in the market, then the implications of the reasonable inference of that is that prices are going to be driven down to a competitive level. Everyone's going to be trying to steal market share, and everyone's going to be driving prices down to a competitive level. And if your cost savings, or if you become more efficient, reduce your cost savings, that will, by matter of course, flow through to the benefit of consumers. It is only in situations where you don't actually have a competitive market in the to begin with, that one has these concerns that, well, any cost savings will simply be absorbed by way of profit. And so, there's all these debates about, is it really even a public interest consideration? Isn't that just an ordinary competition law assessment, or competition assessment that should be done? So those are the two grounds which I think are probably the most contentious. I'm going to leave some time for questioning and comments from the group, but I think there's also just an opportunity, and I think this is, again, going back to my earlier remarks about thinking about these issues early on in the deal making, not just waiting reactively for the Commission to come to you and say, we have concerns A, B, and C. My view is that most transactions, certainly transactions are pro-competitive, are in the public interest in any event. Most deals which contribute towards the economy, to a positive growth in the market, will inherently have some benefit for the entire economy, and that includes HDP, smaller players in the market, medium players in the market, jobs. So where I think we just haven't always spent as much time, and that's perhaps because we've never been required to do so, is to start quantifying those effects. So just like one would approach a merger, where one would start quantifying why this merger would be good for consumers or good for competition, generally, to start thinking about how one quantifies or how one positions a transaction to show that ultimately it will have a good impact on public interest grounds. And even something like sustainability is now in the guidelines considered a public interest ground. So we've done transactions in the renewable energy space, in various automotive spaces and other technologies, where a lot of the motivation is prompted by global developments to move towards greener technologies and more efficient technologies, and previously would never have really thought about trying to position your merger as one that's actually very much pro-public interest, because it's going to have all these tangible effects, and we're starting to do that. And I think that's a dynamic which is probably underutilized or underexplored, and one which I would just suggest you keep in the back of your mind if you are in deal making mode. I'm happy to share the slide deck with anyone who's interested in it. I find it a bit boring and tedious to go through it slide by slide, but it covers a bit of the trajectory of the last 10 years, the level of activity. It breaks down each of the public interest criteria and gives a very brief overview of what is sought to be achieved by it. And I think we've probably covered most of the substance in that. So I'm going to stop sharing it. Covered most of the substance in that slide deck. So to wrap up, and then Simona, I'll hand over back to you for any other questions. I think on a policy side, advocacy side, we're doing a lot of work through a lot of different channels to try and communicate the unintended consequences that this policy approach and the enforcement of these public interest factors are having, and will have. On the commercial side, there are, from the legal advice side, it is a real risk. It is one which we believe is manageable. but one which, in order to manage it effectively and really avoid delays and, I suppose, risk of litigation, we think can be managed. We've managed to do this on all the transactions which we've been involved in the last 6 months, and there've been a number of them, very different, but all having the same issues. Ultimately, getting it, a result which clients are happy with. But it does require some groundwork to be laid. And then finally, I don't think we should have sleepless nights over it, insofar as there is that disciplining measure, which is the tribunal, the Competition Appeal Court. And I think if these issues, this is really only the Competition Commission who has adopted this clear policy. It's the tribunal and the Competition Appeal Court is undecided on it, and I think is probably a little bit more receptive to the counter arguments, some of which I've discussed today. So this is just not a sensible approach. Where exactly we land on it and how exactly the authorities are going to interpret it remains open-ended, but there is that safeguard. Simone, do you want to ask a question now?
Great, thanks. No, I don't have another question. It's Simone, by the way. No worries. No, I think that, it's in your lobbying, I think it really is important to drive home the point of, the impact of potential international investment, and that this really could hamper that. We're a multinational. We've got, it's a US-based company. They've only got so much capital to invest. They're going to invest that in markets where they're going to get a return and where their interests are not going to be diluted significantly. And whilst there's always, an interest to ensure that HDI is promoted, it has to be fair and it has to be reasonable and it has to be commercially viable. And it does become extremely difficult to try and get a deal over the line where there are these unknown, vague provisions where you just don't know where you're going to end up, and that the whole transaction is going to be fraught with these types of issues, that need to be dealt with and at a very high cost. So I just wanted to, I say that is a very real issue and should be taken into consideration. But thanks for the preso. It was really good.
Thanks, Imana. I mean, I think that's absolutely right. And allied to that, what we're seeing is the number of other African jurisdictions. So competition law across Africa has just exploded as well in the last 2 years, with a number of national agencies really coming on stream and actually enforcing their provisions. Many of them have been around for a long time, but under-resourced, understaffed, or what, whatever the case may be. And so we're seeing a lot more enforcement activity. So that's I suppose point one. But point two is we're seeing a lot of these African agencies or jurisdictions incorporating public interest considerations, their merger control, and they're incorporating them almost wholeheartedly from the South African context. And so, again, part of our advocacy work is raising the flags to whether that's even appropriate, right? South Africa has its own unique history and reasons why certain socioeconomic policies or objectives feature so highly in our Competition Act. That's not always the case across Africa, across the board. And I think, getting these agencies to really grapple with what exactly is it, where exactly is the harm in your jurisdiction that you think justifies having these public interest considerations taken into account in the first place. But I think the point about deterring international investment is absolutely astute, and it's not a theoretical one anymore. Well, I think we're having those discussions, and exactly as you say, there's limited resources. The rest of Africa is all beckoning. Everyone's trying to deploy resources where, as you say, they think they're going to get a return and their investment is the safest. And South Africa is just not always flavor of the month.
You're on mute.
Well, drinks are on Marina's for not being on mute, and I I am on mute. I wonder if there's any other questions besides Simone. I'm teasing Simone. You're welcome. If there's anybody else that's
Sorry.
got to ask, that wants to ask anything, any questions from anybody? Mike, would it be okay if we drop your contact details in the chat, just in case there's somebody that wants to reach out to you that's got a question that they're not comfortable asking here? They can just maybe drop your email.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Thanks.
Okay, cool. Great. If there are no further questions, then Mike, yeah, I just wanted to thank you again. I know I thanked you already this morning, but you guys are always like willing and ready to come on, give up some of your time to talk to the members, to help and guide the sector forward. We really appreciate that. For those of you that don't know Mike, please connect with him on LinkedIn. You'll find him, Michael James, actually his full name's on LinkedIn, and connect with him, and then you're welcome to engage with him or reach out to myself or Risha. We'll happily share his contact details, that of his team. But other than that, thanks, colleagues. Thanks for joining us this morning. You're getting a couple of minutes back in your diary. Thanks, Mike, to you and the Primerio team. I'm sure we'll be in touch shortly. Have a good day, everyone. And Marinus will let us know where drinks are on Friday. But yeah, have a good one. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Anita. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Anita.